I'm joined today by Nell Bernstein, who's the author of Burning Down the House, as well as All Alone in the World, and a winner of the White House Champion of Change Award. Today we're going to talk about childhood incarceration in the United States. And Nell, I think a good place to start would be, we've talked about adult incarceration rates in the U.S., and how the U.S. is up there with North Korea at the top two in terms of incarceration rates for adults. If we look at child incarceration rates, where does the U.S. rank?
Well, we're at an interesting juncture right now because, on the one hand, juvenile incarceration rates are falling significantly. They've dropped by 40% over the past 10 years. At the same time, we are still the number one in the US, in the world, for locking up our kids by a factor of about 7, I think.
And what types of crimes are getting juveniles in juvenile incarceration facilities?
Well, because juvenile incarceration so often leads to adult incarceration, the important question for me is what type of crimes lead to that first incarceration?
Right.
And there, it's almost always a low-level, non-dangerous offense. Sometimes, graffiti, loitering, public drunkenness, a marijuana charge, and then once you're in the system, endless probation violations. So not the super predator that we were led to believe.
And are there some, I don't know if crimes is the right word, or as you talk about them, status violations that only apply to juveniles, whereas for adults, those actions wouldn't necessarily put them into prison or jail?
That's tricky also because there were some legal changes meant to eradicate locking kids up for status offenses, particularly running away. But a lot of kids I've met are locked up for something that happened along with a status offense. So you run away and you sleep on the street, and that's a crime. So I think minor offenses, some of which are status offenses, would be the most accurate.
And for people who don't know, can you explain what a status offense is and maybe give us some other examples beyond running away?
Sure. A status offense refers to your status as a juvenile. So it's something that would not be illegal if you were an adult. It's only illegal because you're a kid. So running away, underage drinking, truancy, that's a big one. If I don't go to work, it doesn't go well for me, but I don't go to jail. If my kids make the same choice, they're at risk of a truancy charge, that sort of thing.
And you talked just very briefly there about how the initial juvenile incarceration often leads to incarceration as an adult. So I want to take that in a couple of pieces because I think there may be a couple of angles to that. First, let's talk about the sentences. How can a juvenile incarceration sentence turn into an adult incarceration sentence?
Well, here's what happens. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background because this is a figure that really shocked me. 80 to 90% of all American teenagers in confidential interviews will tell you that they've committed an offense serious enough under the law to get them locked up. But most of them are not locked up, right? Nobody notices, they get a pass, or maybe they get some kind of community alternative. And those kids grow up and grow out of the impulsivity that led to that original offense. The portion of the 80 to 90% of Americans who are delinquent, apparently, who get incarcerated, they don't stay straight through to adulthood, but it's a very traumatic experience. Many experience abuse, physical abuse. 1 in 10 are raped by guards. And even without that, it's an environment in which sort of fulfilling all the developmental tasks of adolescence are pretty much impossible. And of course, you develop a criminal identity. So that's why it so often spirals into adult incarceration, along with the stigma and label of being a delinquent.
So let's talk a little bit about that. 80 to 90% of American teenagers admit to some activity that could be classified as a crime, but most will never actually spend any time incarcerated. With adult incarceration, we see the disproportionate application of sentences to those who are poor and to minorities. Do we see those same factors playing a role in what percentage or which ones of those American teenagers end up spending time in prison?
You've asked exactly the right question, and that's why I use that number pretty frequently. I think that some of us are more familiar with statistics like a Black youth is 5 times more likely to be locked up for the same charge and with the same background as a white youth. So there are disproportionalities at every step of the system: arrest, detention, disposition or sentencing, parole, probation. At every juncture, researchers have found not just disparate rates, but differential treatment based on your race and to a lesser degree class. So I think the reason it's so important for me to share that the great majority of teenagers get involved in delinquency is that it really busts the myth that one race is more criminal than another. It turns out as adolescents, we're all delinquents. We have poor judgment, our brains aren't fully developed, and we just need support to get through it.
And let's explore that concept a little bit. So if we look at the cost, and we've explored with adults that very often when it comes to, for example, homelessness, it's actually cheaper to provide housing and basic health care to someone who's homeless than the social costs over the course of a year from that person being homeless. We've talked about adult education. College education is often less expensive than the cost of incarceration. I'm guessing, and I open it up to you to tell me whether I'm right or wrong, that this is even, it's at least equally pronounced when it comes to juveniles in terms of education versus juvenile detention.
I think it's much more pronounced, especially if you consider the opportunity cost of a lost life. We spend $88,000 on average to incarcerate a kid and $10,000 on average to educate a single youth. And the kids know this. The message they get from that is, we'll spend anything to contain you, but nothing to cultivate you. And that's a very destructive message.
When the juvenile detention centers are, well, I'll phrase it a different way. How prevalent is solitary confinement in juvenile detention centers? Because that's something that, again, on the adult side, we've talked about the destructive effects long-term of solitary confinement. And again, from an outsider's point of view, I would imagine that destructive effect would be even more significant to a juvenile.
You're right. I mean, the United Nations calls 15 hours or more torture for adults and has any amount of time in solitary is considered torture for children and teenagers. Officially, about a third of juvenile detainees end up in some form of solitary confinement. It's hard to measure because we don't like to use that word. We call it ad-seg, or my favorite, the reflection cottage. Among the kids I met, and I talked to a lot of kids, I think I met maybe 1 or 2 who hadn't experienced some form of solitary confinement or room isolation.
1 or 2 who had not experienced that, you're saying?
That's not empirical, but if you include things like locking down a whole unit because there's a shortage of teachers, so you're in your cell all day, they had all experienced that kind of intense isolation. And at least a third had experienced formal solitary confinement, so a barren cell with maybe just a blanket.
And Nell, officially, on the record, what are the reasons stated in some or many of these cases? How can we characterize the official explanations for why this solitary confinement is being assigned?
Well, it's interesting. Senator Durbin has held a couple hearings on this, and the official explanation given, I think, by the head of the Federal Bureau of Prisons and given by everyone under the sun was safety and security. Don't take this away from us. It's a tool that we need. But the kids who actually end up in solitary, for example, and I heard this over and over, if you threaten suicide or act suicidal, you'll likely end up stripped naked and tossed into a solitary cell, where a disproportionate number of suicides, unsurprisingly, then occur.
Sure.
If you're the aggressor in a fight, you could end up in solitary. If you're the victim of a fight, you could end up in solitary. If they're processing your papers, you could end up in solitary. The number of reasons is almost beyond reason, really.
Incredible. I want to remind everybody that the books are Burning Down the House as well as All Alone in the World. We've been speaking with Nell Bernstein. I recommend both books. Nell, thank you so much for being with us and really shedding light onto something that many people may not even be aware is going on.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.